Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, duds, slicers, peasants, spazzles, minions, meat sacks. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And let's go to Vietnam. I did a remake of a video I posted earlier and took down about Vietnam because I forgot I had other material I wanted to include that would make my point even more. So what we have is a Barack Obama on his Asian tour, and he went to Vietnam and has lifted the arms embargo, totally lifted the arms embargo against Vietnam. And since 1995, he's the third U.S. president to visit Vietnam, and this arms embargo has been in place for 50 years. So this is a huge deal. And then while he was there, he set up an $11 billion aircraft deal with Boeing as well. And so we have Vietnam now a full-fledged member of the pivot to Asia and joining the U.S. empire. So how ironic, after, of course, recent Vietnamese history, that things should end up this way. And so history proves once again that it's full of surprises. And we also have Vietnam on board with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so they're completely on board with the global empire, both now being able to access American military technology and the doors being open wide for American businesses in Vietnam, but also part of this global corporate governance and these free trade, so-called free trade agreements. And like I say, this is all the more ironic after years of war with the United States, where millions and millions of Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodians were killed, and of course over 50,000 Americans were killed as well. And my father was in Vietnam for 2 years during those years, 1968 and 1970, and he was amazed at how much the Vietnamese really loved Americans and continued to watch how much they admired Americans after the war in spite of everything. And so he definitely made note of that. And then we have Vietnam since the war itself. Of course, having a war with China not too many years after the U.S. pulled out of Vietnam, and continuing to have confrontations with China in that region. So they're a natural partner for this United States global empire and this pivot to Asia. And so what do we have in the background history? Of course, we have Vietnam is the 8th largest weapons importer, as a matter of fact, right now. So that puts them very high on the list for American corporations, and for the timing of lifting this embargo. They've increased their arms importing 700% from 6 years ago. So no wonder they're on the radar for U.S. corporations. Just last May 12th, there was the first defense symposium in Vietnam with Boeing and Lockheed Martin, and they've been in talks with U.S. arms manufacturers for several years. So no surprise that there'd be talks going on between Vietnam and U.S. arms manufacturers for several years, and now we have the outcome of that, the lifting of the arms embargo, and these companies going into Vietnam. And so they're going to be going head to head with the traditional suppliers of weapons to Vietnam, Russia, Israel, and India. And so now the U.S. will get their part of the market. And the U.S. is certainly poised to make this move and dominate the Vietnamese market, because if you go back even a few years, we find out that there's a huge corporate, American corporate and transnational corporate presence in Vietnam. So like I say, once again, all those years of war, and yet we end up having Vietnam end up being somewhat of a vassal state to the United States anyway. In May of 2007, 9 years ago, a delegation of 18 groups went to Vietnam and wanted to expand corporate influence there. And there was a bilateral trade agreement in 2001 that opened the door to corporations at that time. And it's funny to look at the list. You see just about every transnational American corporation you could think of moving into Vietnam. And the ones that weren't involved in 2001 certainly got on board in 2007. So in 2001, we had companies like Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, IBM, Cargill, Microsoft, Citigroup, Chevron, Ford, GE, UPS, Procter & Gamble making huge investments in Vietnam, and investing in a lot of cheap labor and cheap products, and just getting in on the local domestic market as well. You can even find McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken there. And in 2007, we had corporations increasing their presence, including a lot of newcomers, with Boeing, Chevron, ExxonMobil, IBM, Time Warner, Abbott, Ford Motor, GE, Alcoa, ConocoPhillips, Hewlett Packard, Raytheon, and Universal Telecom all going into Vietnam. So we're now making the transformation of Vietnam from a former battleground to a pariah state to an important Asian partner to now being incorporated back into the U.S. global empire. So like I say, very ironic. Looking at the details, it was particularly disconcerting for me to find out that there's a port there. It's an international port called Cam Ranh Bay, and it's a strategic deep water base in Vietnam. And the Russians had controlled it for some time, and now Vietnam uses it for their own submarines. And that my father was a harbor master for the United States military at Cam Ranh Bay in 1970 and oversaw all the port operations there. And so it's kind of probably a good thing that my dad didn't live to see this moment, although he would have been struck by the irony of it all and admired the Vietnamese people. And so there we go. Vietnam now going to be buying arms, and I assume since they're going to be buying arms from the United States, we're really good buddies now, and they're going to help us encircle China and Russia further in this pivot to Asia. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.